Wonderful. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، ويمسيكم الله بالخير جميعا. أهلا وسهلا بكم مقدرين. أنا عبدالفتاح المؤمن وزملائي المهندس سامي الحداد والمهندس علي العباد. نقدر لكم الحضور وللضيوف الشكر لقبولهم تلبية الدعوة في تاسع لقاء من سلسلة لقاءات أتليه العمارة، ثقافة وعمران وحرفة وشريكه المعرفي الجمعية السعودية لعلوم العمران. وضيوفنا لهذه الليلة ننوه أن هذا اللقاء سيكون باللغة الإنجليزية لهذه الليلة. اسمحوا لي يعني أن أقدم باللغة الإنجليزية. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight is our 9th virtual meeting of Atelier Arc platform. Our guest speakers tonight are خوان, Mوليرات, the founding principal, and Andrew, Jordjiadis, the project director of PLUSURBIA, Miami, Florida. PLUSURBIA is an ensemble of design and engineering practices founded on the precepts of collaborative creation, putting people first. A finely tuned design firm of interwoven talents, academic interest, and professional strengths. The studio was launched as an experiment to marry context-sensitive urban design with planning, architecture, and mobility. In just over 10 years, PLUSURBIA design has become a leader in its fields of expertise, receiving dozens of national and international awards for city building, placemaking, urban design, mobility, and economic development planning. The studio has worked extensively in Asia, the Middle East, North and South America, revitalizing neighborhoods and designing new cities, improving the built environment through calibrated interventions at many different scales. The firm's slogan is, our passion is design, our goal is to create places with lasting values for the communities that they serve. Before we start, may we kindly and for better reception ask all dear audience to mute their cameras and mics. Also, we kindly ask all to prepare their questions and share with us at the chat box. We shall attend at the end of the presentation to them. Likewise, for those who wish to interact through an audio note, they may kindly raise their hands at the question and answer session following the presentation. At the moment, we would like to welcome our valued guest speakers and ask them to take over and start their presentation. Juan, Andrew, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Abdulfattah and Atelier Arc for having us. This is a wonderful opportunity to show you a little bit of what we've learned over the years. PLUSURBIA, my name is Juan Mوليرات. I'm the principal of the firm. I'm also the president of the American Planning Association in South Florida, where we have an incredible amount of planners. So we have a lot of competition in South Florida. And in part, that's the reason why we have done work outside of Florida, is because over here, the competition is stifling. But we're very happy in Florida, and we're very happy to see that there's a lot of parallels between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Florida, the kind of work that you do, and how amazing the progress that you have made in terms of public transportation in the recent years. It's very similar to ours. And so we're going to share our story with you. PLUSURBIA is a 10-year experiment, really, that began with mobility and placemaking as part of urbanism. We're a very small boutique Miami-based firm, and we have 3 different offices, including the Caribbean, because we love the sun and the beach. So we like the opportunity to have the excuse to go to nice places for work. But all in all, we have strategic partners around the world. We have about 7 offices that we work constantly. with almost 100 people in the whole team of this strategic consortium. Our, forgive me, but our religion as professionals is to listen. And listening is the most important part of our work. And then we question and then we draw. And we do this constantly, learning from each place, each culture, and each people that are involved in the projects. The team the core group of the team has remained constant. As you can see, we are a handful of people. But I will remind myself especially that it is not the number of people, it's the quality of the people. And so the team that we have are experts in their fields. We are essentially communicators, we are mediators of ideas, we are city artists and mobility experts. And we don't need anything else. So we are very, very happy the way that we are operating. And we've been very, very fortunate to have been invited to many places in the world to do work. Over the last 10 years, we've done almost 150 projects in 4 continents. We're still missing Antarctica, but I hear that there is no urbanism in Antarctica. So I don't think that one will come. But we have a decentralized horizontal structure, and we depend every project on the people in the place to teach us. We are not experts everywhere in the world. So every time we do a new project, we depend on those people in that country to help us realize the challenges and the conditions that they are suffering or that they see as an opportunity for us to visualize a better future for their cities, a better future for the places they live. And we've done this in many, many places, but as I will show you in a minute, the work that we do is through a method that has been honored in recent years with some awards, international and national, which, you know, a lot of people say, well, why do you talk about awards? Awards are really a way to recognize one's work, and it gives us the breadth to keep striving for better. So we are not complacent on the work that we have done. We look forward to more challenges to improve the ways of life of more and more people. In the case of Little Havana, it comes very close to home, and I'll show you why. So I'd give me a few minutes to show you a little bit of our transformation as a firm. We started in 2009 in the middle of what they call the Great Recession. All the cranes that were in the US left, and the economy crashed. And so we followed the cranes. We went to China where people were building because there was a great migration into urban areas. And little did we know that the kind of projects, this is 2010, the kind of projects that we were going to be doing, in this case, a new city in Chongqing for healthcare and the age in place ideals, had a lot to do with mobility and transit-oriented developments. In fact, this one that you see here, we didn't think much of it back in 2010, but it was the beginning of the Chinese expansion of high-speed rail. And this is a completely new city that we designed from zero. And as you can see, the axis, it is integrating nature, it is integrating the station into the urbanism. And we did this constantly. And within the last 10 years, we've worked in over 24 cities in China, big and small, designing high density of neighborhoods and towns to capture that migration that has been happening from the rural areas into the cities. And back then we understood that it wasn't just about planning, right? It was also about the architecture and about, more than anything, the behavior of mobility, which is a result of a well-orchestrated project, considering not just the 30,000 feet above our heads, but also how the detail at street level is put together. And if we sacrifice that detail, that scrutiny, it will be disastrous for our city building. So the architecture is extremely important. The way the buildings, as you can see in this image, meet the street, provide shade, the landscape, the way cars park, that has been our interest for 10 years. And we have little by little begun to really unravel the way that these things are put together into transit-oriented developments. Nowhere is more evident than where we have projects where two modes of transportation meet each other. In this case, high speed and the waterfront, right? Changing from land to water. So from China, we've done work in Oman, in the US, in Latin America. The way that one connects, the way that one walks, transfers from different modes of transportation is essential way of moving, is essential to our projects. And the architecture is also important. So we depend on the local architects. We don't know everything in the world, and we don't pretend to. We're not one of these boastful architects that says, I will do everything for you. We don't. We work with local architects in every project. In this case, the architecture was done with Chinese architects in one of our projects, which needs to be iconic. It needs to be memorable. It is, in this case, in the South China Sea, and as you can see, the architecture is very culturally related. In 2015, we realized that, we enjoyed working abroad, but we had big problems in Miami. The main problems in Miami were transportation, mobility, and the way that we honestly did not care about our streets. So we started working with the planning departments. We started working with the departments of transportation to transform these streets with transit-oriented developments. And one after the other, we realized that there were opportunities for developers, for places, for people to live close to transit and have other methods of mobility. So we got into infrastructure. This is one of the projects that we designed a couple of years ago. One of the, it's the largest park. It will be the largest park currently under construction with this bridge right at the entrance of Miami. Worked with several engineers to put this together. And not just the infrastructure, but the architecture that comes with it. You can see at the end of the slide, that's downtown Miami with Miami Beach on the left-hand side, and the TOD that connects the North Corridor, which my colleague Andrew will show you in a minute. But this was systematic. Everywhere we found a need, people yearning to have the option to move in a different way that wasn't just the car. So little by little, we became more and more experts in the way people move, in the way people live, play, and work around transportation. So that essentially has become our focus. Our main focus for our office has been transit-oriented development, or what I would like to say, development around transit. I think that if you turn the words around, it is much easier to understand. This also an image that for our Hialeah TODs, which was awarded for the Florida Planning for Economic Development. And with that, this is a very brief intro of 10 years of blood, sweat, and tears, as we like to say, but a lot of joy. So in the last few years, we were very fortunate to have Andrew join us. Andrew is a long-time friend. In fact, I knew him before we started the office. And Andrew has been indispensable in producing and leading many of these TODs in our office, some of which he will show you today. He has a long-time career as an architectural designer, as a planner, and really, ultimately, Andrew, I'll leave you with a very good friend. So Andrew, take it away. The show is yours.
Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
So, and on the next slide, please, Juan. What is TOD? Transit-oriented development, the big question. And just for the sake of contrast, we look at a very evolved, mature city. Let's choose Paris, for instance, and you see, I don't know if it's Gare de Lyon or Gare du Nord here on the right, but you see the train station and its sheds, and it's embedded in the most glorious urban fabric, which is dense. You can see the streets and the squares and the boulevards are carved out of clay, it seems, because of the fabric being so mature and shaping beautiful spaces. On the left, at the time, it was Miami's only train station, which was the Amtrak terminal. And you see that there's a metro rail train station about a half mile away from it and no way to walk from one to the other. And then between them is a wasteland of all sorts of parking lots and one-story houses and basically bleakness, which doesn't give any confidence to the pedestrian. So I would say on the left, that is not TOD. On the right is TOD. Next. And then here's a little 3D view so you can see the difference between the mature urban fabric of the European train station and how when one steps out of the station, you're in a real place. So there's a sense of place there and a true identity that's shaped by buildings, whereas that's not the case on the left. So some TOD principles, we really like to look at two broad categories, which are the public realm and the private realm. And so the public interventions are how is the connectivity, the size of the blocks around the station, mobility, how does one arrive at the station and how does one move about, public spaces, what are the quality of the streets and the squares that one encounters on the way to and from the station. And then on the private side, we have diversity, meaning the mixture of uses and people and density. How many households may live within proximity to the station? And finally, we have typology. What are the building types that compose this fabric? So,
just one clarification.
yes.
Andrew, why you think Todd was associated with train station locations in this case?
Well, can
yes,
you
why Todd idea of Todd associated with the train station?
Well, it can be any transit stop. The example that I showed was just one particular one that was a train station, but really any premium transit investment such as BRT, streetcar, a train. There are many different forms of TODs depending upon the mobility choice and the urban context.
So if there is a bus station, you could apply the idea of Todd, yes?
Certainly, yes. For instance, cities such as Curitiba in Brazil, where BRT was invented, the TOD that is for BRT, which is rubber wheel bus, express bus, was really explored in the 1970s and 80s when that first BRT system was constructed and repeated all over the world. Yes.
Excellent. The other clarification, why you think TOD as a special parameter in the cities? Does that affecting economics, people, attracting of people, real estate, mobility as whole?
Yes, we see even in some real estate ads, sometimes a property is marketed by how close it is or if it's walking distance to a certain station, you know, so they're advertising, there's a premium that is attached to these type of environments. And even in the United States, there's walk score, which tabulates mixture of uses and urban densities, and it applies a walk score, and real estate agents, when selling a property, quote that score in order to market the property. So we do believe that these properties are getting a boost in value due to their TOD relationships.
Excellent. Good job.
Thank you. And so, as you know, you've embarked on a fantastic kingdom building project, which is reinforcing the non-automobile movements, both citywide in terms of the express rail service with the help of the Spanish system, and also, not only are you linking the major pilgrimage sites in the capital and Jeddah and all of the new cities with high-speed rail one segment at a time, but also I wanted to show you the next one, which is the metropolitan scale metro projects that are occurring, so that once one arrives in a city, one can circulate easily amongst the various sites, both residential and employment centers and recreation. So this is an amazing moment in Saudi Arabia, and really an example for the world, because it is almost as if from one generation to the next, the decision was made that we would become a transit-oriented kingdom, which is really unprecedented in the world. And so, as Juan had mentioned, we really love studying the fabric, the tissue of the city, and examining both from that airplane scale and then going down to the street level and really examining the detail. And so this just illustrates in the next one some of the different reports that have been generated recently on that front. So Hialeah, the Smart Plan, City of Miami, a Tri-Rail Coastal Link, and we'll be glimpsing at some of these projects over the next half hour. So this map shows in the United States and Canada, and in Mexico, we have a continental-sized, underutilized rail infrastructure. So we have thousands and thousands of kilometers of abandoned rail right-of-way. So it's really a tragedy because some of these are, you know, the tracks are already in the ground and they're not being used to their full potential. So although rail is busy, in freight, not as much as passenger. In Florida, right now, the state is seeking to reconstruct its rail system. And so we have investments, which you see on this map, occurring both in the private and the public sectors, such as Brightline, which is Virgin Trains by Richard Branson, and other public sector investments that is beginning to form a skeleton of a rail system. This is an example of the TOD, or part of the TOD, being built in Miami's downtown called Miami Central, and that is the terminus of our higher speed rail system by Virgin Trains. And in this case, the skyscrapers are in the station. And but it need not only be skyscrapers. There are many examples in which the scale is much more intimate and walk-up scale. So higher density, but at a lower scale of buildings. And these are from different projects. So station area typologies. TOD takes a different format depending upon several different factors. What is the metropolitan context, and what is the mode, and how many modes are crossing at a certain area? So in this one part of the line that we're examining, we see at least 3 or 4 different station types. The downtown, which is a regional metropolitan hub, midtown, which is a more community, modest scale hub, and then finally, the one to the right, I believe, is Little River, which shows a more neighborhood scale station. And so each of these have different implications in terms of their density, their height, and their attributes. So in the downtown one, we look at the concept of last mile. I don't know if elsewhere in the world they're saying the last kilometer, but what that refers to is the ability of one to walk or to access other destinations once we've arrived. And sometimes this is the most difficult trip of all, and the one that can discourage somebody from actually making the trip in the first place. So if the last mile isn't wonderful, they often want to drive. And so we need to make that last mile wonderful. Next. And so this is the Tri-Rail Coastal Link. As you see, we're going to skip about at some of these different stations of Miami and North Miami and Aventura, and show a few different lessons from each of those in the presentation. And so this shows that multimodal necessity. So this one from Aventura shows the pedestrian and bicycle access. So this would fall within the public realm interventions, examining how does one approach the station, not only by automobile, if you're going to park there, but how would we walk to it? How would we bike to it? Or Uber, or whatever the method is. And so how comfortable and safe is that ride? And then identifying obstacles to that safety and that comfort, and showing how to change that over time. In the SMART plan, which is really focused on Miami-Dade County, we have had the privilege of working on 5 of the 6 different corridors of transit. And as Sami had said, they are all different technologies. One is BRT for now, which will be perhaps rail in the future. Some of them are commuter rail, elevated rail, and there's even streetcar involved in rubber tire trolleys. And we have the higher speed terminus of the Virgin Trains, plus the airport. So basically it's a multimodal environment, each with different technologies, speeds, and station spacing, excuse me. So the east-west corridor is the first one we'll take a glimpse at. And this animation shows briefly how the east-west corridor links the downtown and the airport to a major university campus, which is Florida International University, and then all of the communities between those two poles, such as Blue Lagoon and the Dolphin Mall, and I'll show you the plans for those as well.
Andrew, may I ask, while you're sharing this and the different type of trans, what governs the infill development between the stations? We have different type of station, different type of transits. As as planners and urban designers, what makes it a successful development infill, and what is the criteria?
Well, some of the stations definitely have a theme. For instance, I could say the university campus, is really, of course, driven by the activities of the university, whereas others tend to be more employment driven. They're heavy on office and less so on other uses, whereas others are mostly residential. And I think it really has to do with some of the context. For instance, the ones next to the airport, it's a harder sell to imagine apartments and villas, especially with the noise of the jets taking on in one of America's busiest airports. So sometimes it's a negative factor which makes the decision lead toward a certain preference of a use or not, or a certain density or not. But it really has to do with the quality of the transit, the frequency of the stops, because the more favored stations, the ones that have better service, generally have more residential demand to them as well. So I hope it's hard to answer all the different factors, but there are also, of course, economic studies that are prepared before each of these design studies, which give us the target ranges of what the market can support and absorption rates, so that we don't overshoot and perhaps draw too optimistic of a picture, or a picture that would maybe we have to acknowledge that it would take 3 generations rather than 1 to build that out. So we're always conscious of trying to remain realists, even though we want to be also idealists for our city.
In fact, in many projects, we come up with these beautiful renderings of these beautiful places, and then the data comes back and we have to bring it back down to reality. And so the images are not as wonderful, but they're real. And so we hope that, in the future, 40, 50 years, things will change. But, there's renderings that I will not show you today because they are not as beautiful as the visions that we have.
Our economic advisors will often stand there above our shoulder and say, that can't be 15 stories, you must make it 6 stories, and then we're brought down, we're humbled.
Okay.
So this is a comment which, vision precedes code. In other words, we always must vision before we know how to create the legislation to implement it. So coding is one thing, but visioning is another, and visioning should come before the codes or the zoning code reform.
Normally, who established the vision, Andrew?
Yes.
Clients or designer?
So ideally, we'd love to be involved from the very beginning, so that we generate both the vision and then are involved in the code to help implement that vision. In some cases, a vision has already been created either by another firm or by the client, and we are asked to update it or to write the legislation to implement it. So we enjoy working on both type of projects, either the whole package, which is visioning and code, or one or the other. We're happy to participate.
Any cases of a design build Todd, that in your mind, if it is design build, that means vision plus execution become very clear and obvious, and even the output it will be really fantastic, because the client and the designer at once, they're working together.
Yes, certainly. And in certain cases, when it's been a developer tender or RFQ, this has been more so than others. So in some cases, when it's developer driven, and when the desire to build immediately is sort of stated up front, and then the design is merely we're just trying to get to the point of construction documents rather than the longer public visioning exercise, which is meant, to allow several years for its build.
It's worth noting, though, that you cannot build a code. You establish the code, and hopefully that code, the way that you write it, changes the economics, the investment capability of your development, of your developers, your private sector, and that makes change around the station. So Hialeah, for instance, is our best example, where we did the project about 3 years ago, and the economics around the station totally changed, where things are being built right now, but the best metric for me has been the planning director of the city calling me and saying, I've got another application. Another developer is interested in building around the station. Before we did the code, nobody wanted to build a station. It's the image that Andrew was showing you before. Everything was industrial. We changed it into mixed use. We increased the density. We required commercial. And now suddenly there's a lot of interest to build around that station. So that, I think, is the best metric for the success of a TOD, is how many applications will the municipality receive after the code has been implemented.
Thank you. This picture shows the Dolphin Mall TOD, and as you see, there's 2 large enclosed malls and basically a wasteland of surface parking lots, and all sorts of different underbuilt parcels around this station, which will be the one before the Florida International University campus. So this was showing a hypothetical build out, and as you see, it breaks up some of those super blocks that have an excessively large perimeter and begins to make a fine-grained network of blocks, streets, and public squares. And all of them are oriented toward the station, and then there's a gradation of building type and density from the station outward. So this is a way of reclaiming some of that desolation that currently exists, and imagining a sense of place in that spot. We have some renderings. This is from the neighboring actually place on the train line, but it's representative of the type of scale that one would see along this TOD, which shows, as I had mentioned before, higher density, but achieved at a lower height than the things that we have, the projects that we've engaged in Asia or elsewhere abroad. And this shows that we're also interested not only at the higher view, but love getting into the details of paving schemes and landscape and the way that buildings interface with the street, especially at ground level, so that there's a sense of transparency and visual interest. And this one shows a shared space, which is very controversial yet in some places in the United States, but very common in other cultures, in which you remove the curbs and you allow very slow-moving vehicles to even mix with pedestrians in that sort of civilized environment.
Do you see such practice more applicable to our cities? And so now, I probably had during our previous discussion on the main corridors and the transit street, maybe interstate kind of highway that cut cities, and how to make them. And I know we're talking about Todd today, but this is the sticky kind of street, the car relevance street is place making. This is what we all now thinking to kind of give back to our cities, to make them happier, more pedestrian friendly, take part of this car dominance. How viable is this, and how could we also tame, if I may say, the main corridors of car dominance? I know there are practices and there are tracks. You could make cities or streets more car relevance, if I may say, within the kind of slower or smaller kind of corridor. But when it comes to larger street, how would we do such things?
You're absolutely right. A very wide boulevard or avenue or highway retrofit is a much different street design problem than doing a capillary, a neighborhood shopping street or something of that scale. So later on, I'll show you a few renderings that take on the topic of the larger street. But I think that, you know, when we look at the precedent of large streets that move volumes of traffic but are still a pleasant walking environment. So think of the boulevards of Barcelona, like the Passeig de Gracia, or the famous ones in France. You can see an example of places that have wide sidewalks, street trees, interesting architecture, and yet they have extraordinary high volumes of automobiles, you know, sometimes 50 to 100,000 per day, which compare to our interstate freeway volumes, but they do so without being a blighting influence. They're a value-added good address, whereas our interstate freeway systems are not an address, but something we turn away from because they're so offensive. So, you know, even in the United States, we could do another topic on this, but there's a wave of freeway teardowns that is occurring in American cities, in which, you know, highways that were once elevated are now turning into boulevards at grade. So that's another thing we could speak about in the future.
Wonderful. I think we may need, because I think this is a hot topic that we're really debating and discussing and trying to solve. Such example you just showed us in the previous slide can be very much tailored to many of our smaller street, you know, back of Commercial Street, Barrel Street, neighborhood Commercial Street, but also major corridors is a big issue that if we could come up with a solution that, as you said, more happier, more pedestrian apparently for the city would be great to complement the story.
Yes. So then this is the Miami Intermodal Center, and it's a particularly interesting one because there are about 5 or 6 different modes converging upon this one spot. One is the airport itself, which is one of the busiest in the nation and services all of Latin America, direct flights to Europe, and etc. Miami International Airport. And then there is the three different scales of train arriving here: Metro Rail, which is our elevated metro system, the shuttle to the airport, and also an Amtrak station. And I think there's also Tri-Rail. So maybe there's like 4 rail systems coming here, and a car rental hub. So this was an underutilized piece of industrial property that was located immediately to the east of that hub. And this study was looking at how that could be reclaimed to create, you know, at least 20 blocks of urban infill and redevelopment opportunities that is geared toward those who wish to be near the airport, both for employment purposes or even residential in a limited fashion. These are street design diagrams showing the importance of starting to look at the fine scale of both paving, crosswalks, illumination, trees, and how all of this comes together in an ensemble that creates the public realm. And I don't know if this was the right place to talk about it, but nighttime experience is important. As you remember, Abdulfattah, AFM plus Dover Coal & Partners and Ibrahim Muhasib with Rick Hall had a very fun time in 2007, 2008 doing the Jeddah Streetscape Manual. And I think there were about more than 100 kilometers of corridors here, Al-Malik and Al-Nuza, Hamad Al-Jasar, and the road to Makkah, all drafted carefully by Ibrahim, and then with renderings done by us and at Dover Coal at the time. And so this was the conceptual metro plan on the right, and then details for different squares and streets on the left. And on the next slide, there was this was a very quick photo transformation showing Al-Malik when we did during the charrette, just a glimpse of how you could start to incrementally change a very big boulevard into something that is shaded and activated over time and shaped by buildings. So
that's exactly you're answering my previous question in a layer, which is wonderful. Thank you. So you still could make it happy, lively, and still with having the car transit not delayed, but can also
Yes.
pedestrian attractive as well.
Yes, and once again, you've already started to do that in Saudi Arabia, because these roads have a boulevard format. In some cases, they have a slow-moving frontage road where drop-offs and parking and access can occur, but then the main thoroughfare is unimpeded by those, that parking and such. And so this is once again a detail of that Woonerf, which is the Dutch term for the sticky street or the shared space street. And you see that cars almost fearfully come as intruders into the space at a very slow pace and freely mix with pedestrians. And there are no curbs, and sometimes they're just bollards and people. And we see that this is more effective in taming driver behavior than simply posting a speed limit sign, which doesn't do much to affect driver behavior.
So creating the obstacles through the zigzag and through the material surface
Yes.
and others, and that can be applied in residential as well, isn't it? In residential neighborhood, or may it be on commercial street as well?
It can be in both. And in fact, most of the Dutch examples were tried out on residential streets before it became common on commercial-oriented streets with ground floor retail.
Andrew, in a sharing street or sharing places, with all of the previous slide shows a beautiful composition, people, car movement, pedestrian, cafe. How are you articulating such corridor, a sharing space corridor, and comparing with the normal streets? How do you apply the safety on that corridors?
You're right. This often provokes a lot of anxiety by the traffic engineers and other stakeholders with whom we work, because when they see a curbless street and they say, you mean the cars are going to go right in the middle of the dining? And they can't believe it. It's one of those things where it's counterintuitive, because the fact that it's a perceived danger makes it safer. And the whole notion of visual friction and the anxiety, the healthy anxiety that the driver feels while going into this type of space, is the very thing that makes us tap very lightly on the gas pedal rather than step hard on the gas pedal. So it is a hard sell, and we often spend a lot of time working with the traffic engineers and even sometimes having to travel with them to show those who are approving such a street to let us build one. We have to show them examples before they let us build one.
How do you composite the team to design such corridor or streets with pedestrian streets? How do you composite? So, what is the discipline? Whom the disciplines? Engineers, for planner, urban designer, landscaper. How do you composite that team?
Yes, so on the public realm designs, especially where infrastructure is prominent, we always work with a qualified engineer, and particularly an engineer who is revolutionary and progressive, because there are, of course, some types that are very uncomfortable with these, what is to them an exotic cross-section. And so we like to work with those who have for whom this isn't so exotic and this is, rather normal. And so they can articulate it easily to those who will be asking approvals.
Any guideline for this process? Any design guideline that you follow within for this process, or is it depending on experience?
Well, we draw from experience, but we also love looking at different manuals, like the ones that we've talked about in previous conversations, the context-sensitive solutions manual, and also a series of manuals which Rick Hall, I think, had been, he was a contributing author to it, who worked on the JEDA project. And then there's also the NACTO, National Association for transit officials, I believe. So the NACTO manuals have 5 or 6 sub-manuals, such as planning for bikes, planning for transit-oriented streets, planning for accessibility. And those manuals are excellent because they show best practices that can be adapted. The dimensions can be adapted for different communities, but the cross sections are all rather good in those manuals.
And Andrew, if I may ask also, since we are still in this slide, which we all love to bring or kind of convert our street into, we were talking about, you started about the anxiety that people may build with in having the cars kind of really still there, but we don't trust them. But the one more challenge that I always think of when looking at street solutions, especially with our existing cities, is the current parking solutions and moving cars from store frontage,
Yes.
and accommodating them somewhere with the traffic solutions or alternate solutions to make this more pedestrian, more cleaner, and so with having car only moves when needed and as needed, but it turns into pedestrian. So where those cars will go, where the parking, what kind of parking solution you envision from past experience?
Well, you're absolutely right. In creating park once environments, we always look at ways that parking can be threaded artfully into the community fabric. And this type of street that you see on the screen is really the exception to the rule. Most of the streets would be normal streets that have maybe on-street parking. So one row of parking at the curb behind, in front of the row of trees or street furniture. And then so the default condition usually is parking at the perimeter of the block, and then at the center of the block, hidden from view, supplemental parking, either in the form of a surface lot or a garage. And in places where the land value justifies it, occasionally we get to draw underground parking, but that's a little bit rarer in places because it's more costly, of course. But
I'm sure it's easier when you take over from vision to coding, and then you place the coding for how parking is treated and hidden or kind of still satisfied, but is not too far, but is not in the front, isn't it?
Forgive me that I changed the slide, but this is another example of the same street, which was the one that was preferred. If you can see on the left and on the right, you see a change of pavement, which is a flexible space for parking or for walking. And I think that the word flexibility is extremely important, because one of the things that I want to make sure that it's very clear is that even though we're talking about TODs, and the access to the station is one of the most important things. So the redesign, what we call the rebalancing of these streets to allow for flexible access for non-motorized transportation, meaning bicycles and pedestrians, is extremely important. Why? Because most people that access a station do not come by car. And those that do have direct access to that, what we call park and ride, which is large parking garages. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't put parallel parking on the streets, as you can see in this image. We have that flexibility. And I think, again, to allow for more pedestrian activity with the ability to keep the car in place, I think it's important and it's worth noting.
That just takes me to another, I mean, more related subject within this kind of space, urban space and placemaking. It's all about the urban ingredients, if I may say, on those within the MPhil. That makes this more kind of user-friendly, user-happily, you know, the different elements of the space, and you know, different, probably a corn cellar, or you know, those type of MPhils that you see and you make you love coming back to the street. How do you look at this versus the codes, you know, that kind of rebuild them from happening?
Well, we'll touch soon on some form-based codes examples as the implementation for this type of development right at the end of the presentation. Would it be okay if I talk about?
Sure, go ahead.
Andrew, before you move on, I am not savvy enough, but there's some lines that somebody draw on the screen. I just want to make sure if somebody that's tech savvy knows the technology, can we delete those lines?
Oh yeah, there's a green scribble. I didn't put it, I promise.
I didn't either. but
Okay,
maybe someone younger than me that understands the technology.
Okay, maybe we can move. We'll try to fix it while you guys moving. And
Okay.
Clear. Clear all
Go
drawing.
to next slide. Go to next slide. It will be clear.
it has gone.
Okay.
Yes.
So this one is the Fort Lauderdale station for the Bright Line or Virgin Train higher speed rail stop. And there was also a planned streetcar that is now on pause due to financial reasons, but we were enlisted to help Kittleson do the form-based code for the downtown core of Fort Lauderdale and surrounding neighborhoods. And so this is an example of a code which looks at both the regulating plan of the zoning districts, and on the right you see what is called the ABC streets map. And so in a code, it's always important to acknowledge which streets are of the highest priority that get the best treatment, because not every street in the city can be great pedestrian frontage. Some are more messy, some are more utilitarian, others are more geared toward pedestrian and shopping. So each street has a different context. What you see in dark blue are also the super blocks that need to be cut up or in which new connections needed to be added. Then there are several pages that show the different cross sections that are envisioned on a street atlas. So then you would see how the streets ought to be rebuilt in the future in order to reinforce the pedestrian comfort and safety, and also ease of access to the transit. And finally, then there are building typologies or building types, and which would have the dimensional requirements, so that we would be able to compose that fabric with buildings of varying height and varying scale that meet the density requirements for that transit investment. And these are samples of the building type recommendations. And these are also ones for transparency, because nothing worse than walking along a blank wall, which happens a lot in our country. And so we want to avoid blank wall syndrome, so that safety and visual interest can be encouraged by having lots of transparency, especially in the first 2 floors.
Day and night as well. I mean, and
And at
also
night, yes. So we call that CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, CPTED, which is a series of principles that we look to thwart antisocial behavior and crime through good design.
like bank designs. A new bank designs is all about full transparency for security reasons. What is minimum percentage of transparency typically in code in urban streets?
Generally, in ground floors of retail environments, it tends to be a minimum of 50 or 60% glazing at the ground floor. But in residential and office upper floors tend to be less, usually 15% minimum, 10% in some cultures, depending upon the climate, of course, and the local building practice. But we see that there's a range of percentages really depending upon the use and the desired, building articulation. And then, of course, there's recommendations also on making sure that street trees have a longer lifespan by looking at proper planting regimens and other details, so that we can keep that important feature of the pedestrian comfort intact, which is the tree, and the urban tree.
So there's specific trees, if I may say, are more appropriate for an urban space than normal trees.
Yes, particularly trees that tolerate a lot of foot traffic along their roots, and those which can sometimes be drought tolerant in case watering isn't occurring as often as it should be. And so a series of factors would lead us to choose one tree over another. Sometimes it's, even goes down to how often the tree sheds its leaves, so that it's not too messy of a tree, for instance. And many other factors would lead one to choose one or another.
That's where you need an expert landscape designer with the team.
Certainly. Yes, a local landscape architect will help us to be species sensitive, because sometimes if we land in another place and we don't really know yet, even if we thought we've researched it, we really need somebody local to help us understand it. And then this is a very new science in form-based codes, which is sea level rise adaptation strategies and resilience strategies. So both the form-based code for the entire city of Miami, Miami 21, is undergoing a resilience audit right now so that these things can be built into it. And we were able to put some of these recommendations into the Fort Lauderdale downtown code as well. So we see that coastal Florida cities and places around the world that are threatened by sea level rise, like Holland and Bangladesh and Rio and the Maldives, all of these places are low-lying, and they have high population densities that will be threatened by 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise in the coming 50 to 100 years, which we need to think about already.
Would cities like Dammam or Jeddah have to consider such a threat, probably even in the long run?
I believe so, because I believe, like, I remember when I was in Jeddah, we had the heaviest rainstorm of the year, and because Jeddah has not a stormwater system, there were trucks that had to suck the water from the edge of the streets in several districts. I remember the trucks going by, and is that still the case in Jeddah?
Things has improved. Still, they are working on it, and hopefully they put solution. But I'm talking. Let's look at Dammam. If it may have a better, even efficient system for storm drainage, would the sea rise be a threat, or that would require to do sense and assessment and so before to do so?
I think, I don't know what is the elevation of Dammam above sea level. I know that Jeddah along the Corniche is in some cases less than 2 meters. And so Jeddah definitely is threatened along the Corniche, but I don't recall what the elevation above sea level is for Dammam. You would know better than I do about that.
Approximately 2.5 to 3 meters in some locations, yes. And we're anticipating within 50 years that it would increase 50 centimeters approximately.
I see. So it's similar than in some places, some parts of Miami, in which at 2.5 to 3 meters, the groundwater is also becoming higher as the sea level puts pressure on the ground aquifers. So we're seeing that the ground is becoming more susceptible to flooding, even in fair weather times, because of that phenomenon. So I don't know the geology of Dammam, but I imagine that it could be like a sandy substrate similar to maybe Miami's, and so maybe it is under threat as well. Finally, this is very near the end of the presentation. These are a few renderings done for zoning studies along that 3-county northeast corridor. And this is Wilton Manor, showing a potential station location, and then the ability to redevelop and the surrounding properties to add density around that station and new riders and new residents.
What is the minimum length of the corridors, Andrew? Like this project now, let me know what is the minimum corridor to call it corridor and make impact. This is one. The second, how do you call the owner around the corridors for improving buildings and increase the densities and that's properties?
So basically, the first question is, how do we determine the amount of land that's studied around each station?
The length of the corridors. Okay, if you're giving corridor, is there any minimum length for it?
Well, no, this one is a very long corridor. It's actually hundreds of miles long, and it has two different speeds which will be accommodated there. So one is a commuter rail that has very frequent stops, and the rest in the higher speed express train, which accelerates to up to 120 miles per hour between cities. And then some of the stations have both the commuter and the higher speed, but the commuter rail is only about 50 miles long, and the other one is 280 miles long. So really, it's two different size corridors. The east-west one that we had showed you previously for Miami is only about 10 miles long. Juan, am I correct?
Yes, a little longer than that.
A little longer. So
I think that the question that's most important, which is related to what you asked, is the distance between the stations, which then depends on the mode.
Yes.
So, Andrew, if you'd like to expand, just
well, yeah. So
really interesting, depending on what you're looking at.
So for the commuter rail, we're seeing there's most of the stations have a little over 5 miles between them. In some cases there's 10 miles, but then there's also the metro rail and certain parts of the heavier commuter rail which have as little as 1 mile between stations, like in the case of the Miami and Wynwood example. And then for the higher speed express train, we see a minimum spacing of 25 miles between cities. And then there are 50 to 60 mile stretches like the ones before Orlando, which have the fastest cruising speed because they have a longer stretch without stations.
Yes.
May I ask, I mean, I know that when we work on TOD and when we try to probably select which type is more applicable on a certain corridor, sometimes we have 2 lanes crossing, and that gives it probably a different kind of importance for the urban infill, if I may say, or the transit capture in between. What gives this more importance, and what planners should normally would do?
Yes, I think that you're right. Wherever we see a confluence of several different lines or nodes or more multimodal rich area, that TOD or that TOD will become more important. So in cases where we see the convergence of a high-speed rail, for instance, with a metro train and also a bus, so there's 3 or 4 different motorized modes right there, plus the automobiles and the cyclists and the pedestrians that are enforcing that. Those become much more important than ones that have a single station of a VRT or a streetcar.
And does that kind of more govern what type of different infill to do, or that is all depends on the contextual where it falls, like whether near airport or whether within a busy downtown commercial or so?
Yes, I think both are correct. The context and, because we often design in public, there's also the having to go through a more transparent and democratic, dare I say, or political process of designing in public and with neighbors. And sometimes a limiting factor can be the appetite that the surrounding residents have for tall buildings or more density. So we also have to listen carefully to making sure that the scale that we propose is palatable, acceptable to the different community stakeholders. And sometimes what we have in mind as planners, even though we say, we recommend 18 stories of 100 units to the acre, but it may be difficult to convince residents to want to support that.
And also a very important factor is the economics, right? The appetite and the ability to absorb certain types of program. In Miami, what we're seeing right now, it's an extreme example of an extreme affordability issue, right? So the prices in Miami are extremely high. Most of the product that was being produced still today is luxury, so that leaves very little room for low and middle income. So these TODs are an opportunity to also build smaller, right? Build in places where you don't need a car. A car, in many cases, if you are in the unaffordable bracket, I guess, that makes more than half of your income owning a car, between the insurance, the gasoline, and the car payments. So you live in a TOD, you don't need a car. You don't need a car, you can pay a little more for your home or for your food. And so Miami is like an extreme example of the affordability crisis that we're living in. So that is also something that the cities in the Miami area, in the South Florida area, are looking into. How does TOD improve affordable conditions along corridors? So that's also from a political and economic standpoint, TODs can bring a lot of solutions to cities.
Great. Looking at Miami and now that you're saying, and that does not make, it's not much different from our climate, from our from car dominance to our cities and so. And you've been now assessing it and probably worked on many new improved solution. And what kind of lessons that we can probably immediately could borrow and adapt to our cities?
Well, first of all, about the climate, we can't, even though we both have very hot climates, sometimes more humid, sometimes more arid feeling, we can do a lot by improving the pedestrian experience through the use of canopies, awnings, building articulation, colonnades that produce shade, and street trees. And so all of these things can drastically influence the urban microclimate so that we can entice people to want to walk again. And, you know, when I was in Arizona, I was on a day in Phoenix and it was 110 degrees, but the urbanism was good and there were misters and some, and nice architecture, and there were still pedestrians, you know, at 40 degrees Celsius, 42 degrees Celsius, which was unbelievably hot. So we have a lot to do with, you know, on the topic of climate design. And Juan, did you want to say something? I see. Or no?
No, go ahead. We could go on for hours on just.
Yes.
Yeah. And that brings me to the Tampa case study when they brought also the local old streetcar and then bringing them also within the fabric.
Yes.
Any shed on that? How Tampa probably have kind of regenerated and made their cities happier for not only locals, transport on all the streetcars, but also for visitors as well.
Now I'm going to beg for forgiveness, but for time's sake, we actually took out the Tampa example. So I'm so sorry.
Okay.
But Tampa, as you were saying, Tampa is.
We can do a second presentation next week if you'd like.
We can do that. And then there are very few left here in this one. This was a Palm Beach Gardens, which the previous one had, the previous community preferred a more modernist architecture vocabulary, and this community asked us for a more Spanish revival architecture. So you see the architecture renderings look different, but the principles are all the same. It's about density, mixed use, and integration of the station into this new fabric that takes over the old parking lots. This is North Miami for its zoning study, also showing how to reimagine the center intersection of the village right there, and then make new housing around the station. And
Andrew, I have one question here.
Yes.
In a previous image, please, for that intersection. How you as designer, how you determine the form-based code for the neighborhood, for example, surrounded? And is that the second question? Is that true? That is the neighborhood the code makes the neighborhood undesirable. Is that right? That means the neighborhood bothered from the code. Is that? Yeah.
I believe as an optimist, if designed with love and care, I do believe that the TOD improves the livability and the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but I mean, if you know, one could have transit-oriented development that was insensitive as well, and that could be detrimental. So I would say it really does make a difference to have a handle on the different designs, particularly how buildings are they street friendly or not. So it's not important just to be dense or mixed use, but what is the quality of those facades as they are perceived by the pedestrian? That makes all the difference in inspiring them to walk or not.
And Sami, another thing that we have found is that, especially in the areas that we work, around the rail lines has typically not been high demand residential and have not really brought values of those properties up. That's something that's changing right now. Being next to the station is actually, as Andrew was discussing earlier, an improvement. It is actually desirable, but it hasn't been for many decades. So typically you have, and I'm showing this slide because as you can see, the quality that you have here is not very residential-like. You don't have many people that are against the improvement of the area. So going to your second question, you asked about whether or not we had a lot of pushback. We do, sometimes we do. In many cases, they welcome, especially through the visualization that Andrew was discussing before, they welcome the improvement, right? Because they improve their values. So going to your second question about the form-based code, which I think is extremely important. The first thing that we have to consider is the value, right? People are concerned about what they own and how the value of what they own today is going to increase tomorrow because of the project that you're showing them. So our baseline for TOD is always what people own today. Not in terms of value, but in terms of volume, in terms of square footage, in terms of their ability to develop. So let's say that they can develop 2 stories. That is our baseline. We cannot do less than that because that would be considered a taking, which is in US law, it's illegal. So if you take into, sorry?
You mean reducing property rights is a taking, right?
Reducing property rights, which is our taking. And so we start always with those 2 stories in this example that I'm giving you. And then what we do is we typically, because of the TOD requiring minimum density and intensity to make it function and to actually...
What is the minimum, what is the minimum density? That is a good question. Okay.
Yeah, no,
China 400 per hectare, but here in Florida, for example, or such a project that we now are seeing.
So, Andrew, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, it's funny because before the presentation, Juan said they will ask what the minimum is, so you better be prepared. So of course I'm not prepared.
Well, the problem that Andrew and I have is our inheritance in the United States of the British system. So we are still working with acres and miles and feet. So I can tell you that roughly an average is 30 dwelling units an acre. And that it would be within a quarter mile, right? I don't have the calculator ready for me to do the math. But essentially, what you're seeing in these images is the volume that would include, or what that would house enough density. Now, of course, you're going to say to me, because I know that you're very smart, you're going to tell me, well, how big are the units, right? So, because you can show one building and have many, many small units or very, very few large units. And what we typically try to do, which it is my way of not answering your question about density in metric system, I can tell you that the average is about 30 units an acre. But I will answer your question in another way.
I need it in a person, not in units.
So I think
in a person, yes. The density, not by unit, by person living in the hectare approximately.
So isn't 1 hectare is 2.7 hectares in 1 acre?
1 hectare is 10,000 square meters.
1 hectare, so there's 10,000 square meters, 100,000 square feet. So I think there's 2.5 acres in 1 hectare. So,
You can jump. Okay, you can leave it. You can leave it to proceed your presentation.
Let me come to another question I had in my mind, which I wanted to ask you. I know there are different means of transit within the TODES, but is there like an optimal grid or distance between 2 stations within a type? How do we calculate that or govern
so
that?
in extreme densities, for instance, I'm going to tell you in New York, in some platforms, when you put your head out like this, you can see the next platform. It's so close, okay. Meaning that the subway gets out of the station, it's already putting on the brakes for the next one, because the densities are so high that the station is almost spaced at less than a half mile in certain cases.
The density what governs primarily.
Yes,
The
and
distance
If we are retrofitting to an existing automobile-oriented city, what we do is we look for the logical nodes that have already started to emerge in the growth pattern and let that be the driving factor. And then if once we can establish, sometimes those occur at regular intervals already, like spaced on the mile or the half mile because of the underlying street grid. So we look for those nodes in which they're already emerging. And then if we see a very long stretch in which there's nothing for some reason, we do propose one to interrupt, between those two. So there's all different methods. I would say the method differs if we're retrofitting an automobile-oriented city or if we're putting transit in an already dense walkable city, it would be different.
And the one thing that, Sami, I was going to add earlier with regards to the discussion about density is that, of course, density, there's minimums that we go by to be able to provide enough ridership. The other thing that is also very important is the diversity, which is one of the principles that Andrew introduced at the beginning of the presentation, diversity of housing. So to give different options to different people in their stage of life. So young people only, who are single require very small units. And then as you grow your family, you require more units. That diversity around a station will make the monoculture not so stifling, right? So you give them opportunities. That diversity is just as important as the density that you provide around a station.
And I think, Sami, you had also asked about how to involve the owners at TOD. So
yes, and the participation, how they, is there any participation from them that you conducted, for example, for participation, what they want, what's compromising them? Yes. Okay, how do, if you go to existing location, how you are going to change the form-based code of that area, what's the process when they change it? There is a lot of involvement at the stage of form-based code, maybe before you putting the outline of the urban design within the context.
Yes, so in many, yes, sorry.
Yep, this is the verification.
In most of these renderings you saw, they were created during a charrette, so a public design charrette, and that charrette itself was preceded by many months of invitations in which the landowners within a certain radius of the station were each given personal invitations to appear at the charrette meetings. Okay. And so those stakeholders then were, first we ask the question of what do you envision for your property? Then we look at the question of what does the zoning allow and try to get a sense of what the future ought to be. And so yes, those people are usually always at the table if they accept the invitation. And then there are follow-up meetings in case they didn't appear. We try to give 2 or 3 opportunities to engage the owners and stakeholders in that public design process.
Thank you. Will you proceed? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You can proceed the presentation.
Yes,
there is some question, but we will take them after the presentation.
Sure. We're near the very end, and so this is the Tamiami Trail study done for the Sarasota form-based code, and in which there was a long stretch of properties that had been empty for many years because they're not market-based and they're very strict use tables that only allow medical offices there, but the market doesn't exist for that use. So we were proposing that the use tables be more permissive to allow commercial, residential, office, and other uses, and rebuild it along the transit line. This is downtown Hollywood. Also looking at the zoning, both the permitted uses and the densities currently on the law books, and searching for ways to propose modifications to the zoning code based upon the community vision. And that's what this was, a sketch during that exercise. And we are very grateful for having listened and paid such close attention, and for the questions that you will give us now.
Thank you very much. What is an informative and interesting presentation indeed we had tonight. We gratefully thank our speakers, and now it is the time for questions and answer session from our audience. Many questions. I will start with with question given to me. A question from Mr. Salman Al-Amir. The slide showing cars and pedestrian side by side, reminding of Rome and Florence. Are you inspired by Europe, narrow urban areas to some extent? Are you in your design, are you influential by Europe because you're putting sharing streets, you're putting car mixed with pedestrians? Any influence from Europe?
The short answer is yes. Okay. Europe is one of a very prime inspiration because many European cities have a very intimate scale that is pre-automobile. So even where automobiles have been allowed to enter the street scene, they've done so in a more tamed way than American Sunbelt cities, which were built wholly within the automobile age.
Good.
May want to add to that.
We want to take Mr. Ihab Al-Amri. He is urban designer. We would like to hear from him right now.
Is this our Ihab?
That's our Ihab. He's here listening to you, and now he wants to jump in. Ihab, please.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Fattah and Sami, for this inviting our old friend Andrew. Hello, Andrew.
So happy to see you.
Yes, me too. So it is. Thank you for your nice presentation and for this interesting topic and subject that is really now coming to be a hot subject also in Riyadh first. Because Riyadh, you know, have started the metro station, and it's about to start operation in the end of this year.
Yes.
My question here, or we have some consecutive questions. Actually, those two of these will be developed through time, right? It is not going to be developed within 4 or 5 years. It will be developed through 10 to 15 years, right?
Yes.
Okay, then that means the program for the stories should be flexible somehow. That you cannot really predict what type of the fuses that will go there, and the densities and the type of housing demand in those areas, right? So that the flexibility on your coding is something that is very important, right?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. Now, based on your experience, for example, Miami area, or it's somehow similar to Saudi Arabia. It's a car-oriented city, as well as it is really hot and humid. And we have the same case in Jeddah and maybe in the Eastern province. Now, how acceptable this type of development transferring from car-oriented mobility to public transit in America? Do people really started to adapt to this type of mode, or they are against it?
May I, Juan?
Of course.
I'm going to, before answering the question, I just want to tell you, one of our listeners, Cecilia Ribalagua, who's a high-speed rail and TOD expert from Spain, she provided the answer that your minimum threshold of 30 units to the acre corresponds to 80 residential units per hectare. So anyway, just to address that. Now, your other question about do automobile cities, how have they matured and adapted like Miami? My grandfather was on the original design team for the Miami Metro Rail in 1975. He was an engineer who helped plan the Metro Rail system. And when it was inaugurated in 1982 or 3, I think, I remember he was so proud, and we would go on the train lines and they were empty all the time. And the Metro Rail operated at great subsidy for a long time. And there were many American cities which suffered from empty train syndrome. They had the costly new rail investments, and then they just didn't have any riders. And part of the problem was that when we looked at each station, with the exception of downtown, each station was completely a desolate landscape without residential density or mixture of uses. And so there were many people who refused to park and ride because once they get in their air-conditioned automobile, it's just easy enough to drive to the destination. So over time, though, I've noticed in Miami, where I grew up, that as the land development changed at all the stations and real urban density started to be constructed there, there has been a revolution. And in Miami, the Metro Rail trains are very full. They're not like standing room only like in New York yet, but there are a lot of people. Sometimes it's hard to find a seat. And we've seen similar phenomenon happening in Atlanta, which is car-oriented but has a metropolitan rail system. And we've seen that also in Los Angeles, which has set out to correct its car culture and become more multimodal, that trains are starting to fill up. So even in the car-dominated cities, we're seeing a shift away from, towards transit, away from the single occupant car trip. So I'm optimistic that a sort of revolution is occurring.
I think that another thing that you mentioned, Ahab, it's nice to meet you, the flexibility of the code needs to be, you mentioned that you didn't ask it, but you mentioned it, and I think that it would be bad for us not to mention. The codes that we write that are typically form-based, they work with maximums and minimums, and they provide a range of uses. So it is, I mean, I have to mention it because it's very, very important. We can do a vision, our firm does many of them, but unless the code is flexible enough to change with the economics and with the times and with the demands over time, it'll be a disaster. So again, the solution to that question that you didn't ask, but I feel like I have to mention, is that maximums and minimums in terms of densities, intensities, building disposition, setbacks, all these things, and then uses is very, very important. So that over time we can, the code is able to remain alive and also provide the solutions that provide the adapt to the economic times. Does that answer your?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. And what are the, if you'd like to ask about the benchmark example, TOD in Miami area, for example, that we can study and take as a good example?
So as Andrew, if you want to take it, but I was just going to mention something to answer that. Miami, unlike many other cities in the United States, was founded really in the late 1800s. And so it started getting built at the early 1900s, 1910, 1920s. That's when it was being developed. Remember the Model T, the Ford Model T, the first mass-produced car, was in Andrew, you probably not remember the year best, but it's 1917, was it not?
I think it's right before 1920. I think you're right, 1917. Somewhere.
I think it was somewhere around there. So we were building our streets at the same time that everybody in the country was buying cars. So we never had in Miami the earlier version of the city that allowed pedestrians to really move through the city, because engineers and city builders and architects immediately in Miami adapted to the car mentality. So when we are building, to answer your question more directly, when we are building TODs today, in other cities that we work, there is a mentality. Tampa, for instance, it used to have a street trolley. Miami also had a street trolley, but it was very short-lived. Miami is a very, very new city. So these TODs in Miami especially are extremely new idea. Like Andrew was saying, his grandfather built the metro rail, but really, Andrew, you have to admit, there was a metro rail 11 miles long, but there was no TOD around it.
Well, that's what I was saying. There's no TOD in the 1970s and 80s, nothing.
Nothing was built. That opportunity was never built.
Andrew, خوان, sorry, may I interrupt? And Ihab, just stay tuned. Ihab is an old-timer, a guest of honor, and been working with us in multiple projects. But I have a couple of raised hand. I would like to get them in, and they are also having good questions. Besides, we have a couple of good questions at the chat. So let me give you, because the gentleman raising hand, all very important. I'll give you fast questions from the chat, and I would like you to kind of give fast answers to either one of you. Sure. From Engineer Radwan, he says, okay, thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. Does the climate affect the planning process in your design? Since I did not hear it in the master planning project you had shown in the presentation, any point about street and building orientation and related to environment? That's one question. You can answer, then I'll go on the other. You can answer. Does climate, building orientation within your solutions?
Absolutely.
About transparency within the podium, you talk this, but is that you talked about local solutions?
Yes.
Yes. Every TOD is different, right? And we look at landscape, we look at the frontage of the buildings, the awnings, and we were even talking about sea level rise, talking about climate, the most pressing issue. Andrew, please go ahead.
And you talked about engaging local landscape designers so they can add values in this, and traffic consultant as well.
And I'm gonna give you 3 little examples of climate planning, but not limited to these. This is just a brief example of how climate goes into coding around TODs. Miami 21, a form-based code, specifies a minimum ceiling height, because one of the ideas is to allow for cross ventilation and warm air to rise in units. And for many years in Miami, the ceilings were so low because it was only air conditioned. But then if the AC went off, the buildings are uninhabitable. So imagine now light and airy ceilings in the new construction with cross ventilation, so that you can survive without air conditioning if you need to. Number 2, there's a maximum glazing amount on certain buildings, because some buildings were doing glass boxes and then having to tint everything because the sun is so strong here. So they were designing as if there was not a tropical sun. And then they were making the buildings black or tinted in order to make their energy models work. So the maximum glazing limit helps to avoid that problem by having buildings of a higher thermal mass with thicker walls. And then, yes?
Yes, I said wonderful. I have another question.
Sure.
From Ms. Reem Bedr says, hello, nice presentation and rendering. What tools and softwares your company use? Fast. It's a mixture of digital and hand-drawn. So there's SketchUp, CAD, drawing, and then putting it in by Photoshop onto photos, and also yes.
I think the most important software that our studio uses that universities don't teach anymore is the pencil.
Yes,
the pencil is the most.
And I've seen Andrew on them for long. Okay.
Here I have Ghassan.
Yes.
Mr. Ghassan, please get in.
Ghassan, you are welcome for your question.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Sure.
Loud and clear. Go ahead with your question. Hello, Ghassan.
Okay. Hey, guys. Sorry,
Hi.
I came kind of late because I had something to do. But I got a question on the power of eminent domain. Do municipalities practice this eminent domain when they're acquiring both sides of the corridor for mass transit?
They do, but in some of the ones that we've shown, we haven't seen eminent domain used as a tool. The reason is that for the high-speed rail project by Brightline Virgin, it's a nearly 150-year-old Flagler rail corridor that remained in the ownership of the railway since the 1800s. And then in the case of the Metro Rail, it was they were along large street corridors, some of which had medians, and so the viaducts are all built within the public right-of-way. But I don't know if Juan knows a case of eminent domain, but I don't know of one in these projects. Do you, Juan?
It is rare because it's quite controversial. What I can tell you though is in some cases in the North Corridor where more than one mode is coming, the high speed and the commuter, in those places where there's a station, they need to double up the rail lines in order to allow for trains to pass. And what happened, which was really interesting, is that the developers around it, because they wanted the station next to their property for property values, they actually gave part of that space because it was an interested in the property values. So, you know, if you find a good way, you have an issue like that, you'll find that in many cases, both sides of both private and public can work together for mutual benefit.
Well, that brings me back to the next question. Do you guys depend on feasibility studies when you're massing or you're proposing the density on both sides of the corridor, or is it the other way around?
There have been different ways. For instance, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that we all usually have economic advisors on the team that tell us a target amount of retail square footage, residential units and unit size, and other such metrics, so that we don't design just in fantasy world, but actually, you know, build out that economic forecast. And in some cases, when we don't have the privilege of working with one, they tell us, unleash your creativity and what's the maximum build out at this station, you know? And so then we have to trim it back once somebody else provides us with more limiting realistic constraints. So, you know, obviously it's nicer if you don't have to redo the work and you can know the constraints from the beginning.
So I take it.
Wonderful. Ghassan, thank you for being around and for a good question. Gentlemen, before we go there, we have Rahim and Dr. Atif patiently waiting to raising their hand. I have a question for you, and it's specifically being kind of sent to you, Juan, or both, either of you guys, but says a question for Juan. How is COVID affecting community density as we know it? What is the correct new density formula, either per square meter or per square foot? All buildings located on Brickell have maximum of a number of person allowed on elevators, etc. How does COVID make us rethink building design? This question from E. Ribstein.
Yes.
Wonderful question. I was wondering when the COVID question was going to come up. I was hoping that this was going to be the first presentation in months where we weren't going to have to talk about the virus, but I'm glad that they asked. Honestly, just like there's no vaccine, there's no real answer just yet. But we are working within the community of planners, not just our firm, but we have through our channels been communicating a lot about what is the right density and what is the difference between density and overcrowding, right? Yeah. Density is one thing. Another thing is packing people within spaces. So there's a big difference there. The other question that has come up, and I'm telling you, there's no right answer just now. There's just a need for rethinking of the way that we build our cities, and it's very fundamental. The other question that we have is, what is the role of transit going to play in the future? Because a lot of people are afraid. I'm afraid of flying right now. I'm afraid of getting into a train right now. And by the way, in Florida, we have 15,000 cases per day. Okay, so we are on the epicenter. They say that it's the epicenter of the world for the virus. So we are very fearful, especially in South Florida. The person that asked the question was very right. Brickell has high density. In fact, I would argue that there's no need around the stations to have that increased height the necessity to live in skyscrapers with elevators, which are small spaces, very scary right now. In the projects that we've done around stations, we typically try to keep our building types under 5 stories because we feel that there is a neighborhood feel and there's the ability to quarantine in the building block neighborhood scale. When you have skyscrapers, then it becomes a lot more challenging. I don't have a straight answer for that question. I don't think anybody does right now. But it is a very valid question, and it's something that we all as architects, you guys I'm sure as well, looking into right now.
Very true.
Thank you. And let's take Mr. عاطف. حياك الله أخ عاطف. Mr. عاطف الشهري.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Atif.
Greetings.
Hello.
Dr. Atif, you unmute. Dr. Atif was muted. Unmute Dr. Atif, please.
I've been muted by the moderator.
Oh, no, my mistake. Go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. I think it's afternoon now in Miami, so thank you guys for speaking to us from across the Atlantic. Andrew and Juan are, I think, the best prophets for the TOD philosophy, and I think we are all converted. It's logical, I think, but we are still struggling with it here in Saudi Arabia. I'm speaking to you from Riyadh, and I was really touched by the story of your grandfather, Andrew, and you. During your presentation, you answered most of my design questions, but and during your answers to other people as well. But I think we still have here in Riyadh, we are crawling, to be a TOD city still, with the development of our metro line, which is happening very, very slowly. The question, there are no questions, it's very hard to dispute any of the suggestions and proposals in this presentation, especially, the first and last mile and conversion of a street to be more receptive of pedestrian and all of these things, all great concepts. But then looking at, and I'm not an expert in this, but I'm an architect, of course, the whole value chain of TOD, and I'm taking Riyadh as an example. Really the question, when I take a taxi in Riyadh and people know the driver knows I'm an architect, the first question they ask me is about the metro lines, how it would affect their income as taxi drivers, and I think this is the same question that, any new mechanized means of transportation or production had to suffer, from the industrial revolution. The question that everyone is asking and probably didn't come up is the $64 question. What is the ticket price of the final end user? And I'm taking Riyadh as a very generic example of TOD really. And how that if you back engineer the whole thing, what would it mean, on the quality of design, on the coverage of the TOD development, on the amount of investment that whatever public authority is doing for the first and last mile and streetscape, and making the mobility and accessibility of these transportation hubs easy and affordable for everyone. The final ticket price is, it seems to me, from what I hear from people, is the real decision maker of whether they will use this new TOD. Of course, the city is promising, a TOD development here in Riyadh, for instance. And I feel no matter, we live, for instance, when it comes to the first and last mile, and you touched upon that at the beginning of your presentation, here in Saudi Arabia, we have extreme weather So even with extreme design, with extremely elaborate design of first and last mile, if you have the wrong ticket price, nobody will come. You can't encourage them, or you must bribe passengers to use in an extreme climate like in Saudi Arabia to use public transportation. And this, I think, I was inspired actually by the story of your grandfather and the empty trains. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Atif. Yeah.
If you would allow me to respond, and just to continue regarding my grandfather, he used to tell me a story about in the early 1980s and then beyond, about how the taxi lobbyists defeated the east-west extension to Miami Beach, which the engineering team had drawn. And they actually, a nationwide taxi lobbyist group converged on Miami and convinced the leaders to cancel that project because they said it was a threat to their income. So yes, this is the intent is not to put anybody out of business, but we've seen that the taxi lobby has fought Uber and Lyft and rideshare and many other things throughout the world also right now. But it continues to be robust in certain cities like New York, which has an advanced transit system in which, I heard once Andres Luani say the fleet of taxis works hand in hand with the subway system that goes underneath the island in all the 5 boroughs. So really, if we can find a way to have less antagonism between taxis, Uber, and our station areas by really improving the drop-off so that we're actually trying to provide new customers for the taxi drivers rather than defeat them and put them out of business. I think that's a healthier way to look at it, is trying to elevate our brothers and sisters who are driving taxis and Uber and everything else. So, and then regarding, I think then after that you talked about the price of the ticket. In the case of Brightline Virgin Trains, it was really a real estate development proposal more so than tickets generating the revenue. So all of the TODs became the primary economic driver, and the tickets was just, it occupied a small percentage of their overall profit forecast through the year. Most of it was really a land development scheme. Now that's a case when the rail controlled real estate. In many cases it doesn't. So in the cases where it doesn't, there are innovative mechanisms which should be employed so that we can subsidize or fund the rail where ticket prices fail to cover all of the operation costs. And so there's tax increment financing, TIF, and several other, an economist could better explain than I could, but there are many other mechanisms by which we can add real estate of value and allow that to be applied more to the operations, because the rail is providing all this value, but sometimes doesn't get to enjoy the money that is generated from it. But then it has to pay all the price with the
And in Miami, we actually have what they call mobility impact fee. So every development actually pays an impact fee that goes towards mobility. So a lot of and that's why we keep the ticket price extremely economic for everybody to be able to use it. And a lot of the lines, for instance, the airport line, the connection between the MIC and the airport was built with a half a penny, which is another tax that we have. It's half a penny. It's very, very, very low. And over the years, we have saved that money and built additional lines. And the upkeep of the metro rail, for instance, it's part of that impact fee, mobility fee that developers pay in order to be able to build. The other reason why the form-based codes are very useful is because, as I was explaining in one of my earlier answers, we have minimums and maximums for building density and intensity and height. But we also have what we call benefit programs. And these benefit programs allow the developers to build just a little more if only they pay into a fund that then can be for open space, for transportation, for beautification, for many other things. So we have mechanisms for development to actually foot a lot of the monies necessary for transportation to function.
Here we have Mr. Ibrahim Muhassib, an all-time team member. He would like to say hello. Mr. Ibrahim, please.
Hello, hi, Sami, Abdulfattah. Thank you very much for hosting this great presentation. Andrew and خوان, thank you very much. Great to see old friends. Ihab, hi everyone. My question is there, as we've seen the railway, the unused trails in the US, is there any plan of connecting those together on a long term, most probably, as the ones that you showed in Florida?
Yes and no. So pardon me, I wrote back to a different participant when I typed in the answer. I saw it come up in the chat, so pardon me. But so the Bright Line Virgin Trains example is largely upon the FEC corridor, which is that, you know, almost 150-year-old rail corridor owned by Henry Flagler. And so that one is a private rescue of a line.
Right.
And then this is also occurring in a few other spots in the nation. And when President Obama was president, there was the high-speed rail program, which unfortunately it floundered due to political and financial reasons. But what it did do was call attention to upgrades needed in certain corridors. And then, so particularly that's happening in Cascadia, which is the Seattle, Portland, Vancouver corridor. And then it's also occurring in Chicago, in the Great Lakes wheel and hub and spoke system. So we see St. Louis, Cleveland, Chicago. There are new upgrades on the rail lines there. And then also very controversially, there is the Texas high-speed rail program, which one of our friends asked about eminent domain. It's currently the most high-profile eminent domain case in the nation, because it's not only using the abandoned rights of way, but it's also having to look at putting the viaducts across private ranches. And this is being done by eminent domain, so they still are able to have the ranch intact, but there's a column spaced every 100 feet going in the ranch. So the unused rail corridor project is happening in little pieces here and there across the continent, but not in a unified way yet.
Andrew, we have 5 minutes to wrap up. If you finish answering, we will take a quick, very quick question from Mr. Ihab. Then, because we have only 4 minutes now to Zoom will close, we will take it and then we will make the end.
Let's start it very fast before we conclude.
Very quick, yes.
Okay, again, Andrew, I have asked if you can pinpoint a successful TOD that has been built in one of those hot states in the United States, for example, that we can learn from.
So can you cite example of successful projects?
I'll cite a few as fast as I can. One is the Dadeland Mall station, which is almost fully built out on the Southern Metro rail line in Miami, which converted all of the parking lots into high-density mixed-use housing neighborhoods. So Dadeland Mall station. The other one is
Bethesda, Maryland.
Bethesda, Maryland, yes.
Which is also built out, and it's serviced extremely well.
Most of northern Virginia, outside of the capital, has been busy building TOD, the Ralston-Ballston corridor, and many of the different metro lines in Washington. Yes.
Wonderful. I think because we're catching up late with time. Last word from you, Juan, before we conclude. Any last word you want to say?
Well, we have a longer list of TODs and other projects. So if you want more information, our emails are on the board. Feel free to reach out. We don't have all the answers, but we will try and help as much as we can. We are always trying to learn also. So our profession requires us to continuously learn more. So We are very appreciative for your time and for inviting us. We are very excited to share our experiences and look forward to breaking bread with you soon.
Thank you. Andrew, I go.
I couldn't have said it better. I'm very grateful to all of you, and my heart was warmed to see the friends of my dear, my friends.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Then before we conclude this meeting, we would like first to thank you both, Juan and Andrew, for the great event that has enlightened and enriched us and our audience tonight, for sure. Surely many thanks extended to our attendees for their lovely follow-up and valuable participation tonight. Also, not to forget, great gratitude to our associate partner, the Saudi Oman Society, to our team here on the podium and behind the stage. They've been so helpful and really supportive for their great help and wonderful support. Last but not least, a special big thank we want to send to ArcNet and to its director, Architect Mohammed Al-Mishharawi, for their unconditional and continuous support to Atelier Arc platform and knowledge sharing and enrichment that they are striving as well to bring forward to our professional society. We would like to announce also to those who are interested to receive the post of our upcoming events. They can simply follow us on our social media accounts or simply join our WhatsApp group made special for this purpose. Of course, last announcement that this session will be uploaded on our Arc Atelier YouTube channel for people who want to go back to it and have the learned lessons be followed. For our Arabic speaking audience also, we thank you once again. نشكركم. سنكون بإذن الله على موعد قادم يعلن عنه. كونوا مع أتيليه العمارة في مواضيع ودردشات وحوارات معمارية وعمرانية وثقافية وحرفية. إلى هنا نستودعكم الله. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.